As you're grabbing your seats, I thought I would bring a little bit of audio into the room for a bit of inspiration. And so as you're taking your seats, I just want to play you a clip. This was a clip that was, done by the team at Marketplace. So enjoy.
Support for Science Friday's podcast comes from Squarespace.
99% visible is made possible by our fuzzy and cuddly listeners and by Squarespace.
America's Test Kitchen is brought to you.
This episode of Comedy Bang Bang is
Support for This American Life.
They Sent Us in Podcast is brought to you by Squarespace.
It's Jed. Radiolab is supported by Squarespace, an all-in-one website builder that empowers.
Recently launched the latest version of their platform, Squarespace 7, which has a completely redesigned interface integration
offering templates,
integration, Getty Images and Google Apps, and new website templates. The new cover pages.
Incredible feature called Cover Pages. Try the new Squarespace.
Do you remember that from the Super Bowl? I'm talking Jeff Bridges for
Recently,
Squarespace.
when they partnered with actor Jeff Bridges for Squarespace's Super Bowl.
News, they partnered with Jeff Bridges, aka The Dude.
If Jeff Bridges makes you want to make your own Squarespace site, you can start building it today. Go to squarespace.com and use the offer code INVISIBLE to get 10% off your first purchase.
And enter offer code C.
Make sure you enter that offer code though, bang bang.
Use the offer code SNAP.
Enter offer code on
and
air.
enter our offer code STUFF at checkout at squarespace.com/American.
/Radiolab for a free trial and 10% off. All right, back to the battle.
So thank you, Squarespace, for, I want to say, Manish, you didn't notice your voice was not in that, so. Thank you for enduring that. Can you figure out who to attribute the ad to? So we wanted to have a conversation early in the morning that is a grounding one, because at the tension point of personalization and privacy is money. So I'm going to introduce our panel and then kick things off with a few questions to them. I'm going to start with Sarah Von Mosel. Sarah is the Chief Revenue Officer at Stitcher. She oversees revenue for a network that is vast and includes Conan O'Brien, My Favorite Murder, Freakonomics, and before that she led the national team at Market Ingenuity. She worked with us at PRX, and she's held many senior roles in the industry, including ACAS and WNYC. She was also the founder of IAB's podcast standardization group that probably had a different and longer name. Ariel Zarolnik, she's the fund director at the Membership Puzzle Project, which is a public research project at NYU studying and supporting experimentation within membership models, news. Prior to that, she led something called the New Tropic, a local media startup in Miami. Many of you are users of the fan favorite app Overcast, so please welcome Mark Arment, the creator and of Overcast podcast app, and also an independent podcaster himself about Apple and technology. And we have Michelle Mooy, who's a policy advisor and strategic consultant on privacy, data, and ethics. She has been working with organizations to develop forward-thinking policies and practices, and she started her career as a software engineer in Silicon Valley, and she moved then to product, marketing, and now public policy. She is in DC with the Center for Democracy and Technology, really creating some groundbreaking work in legislation. And Richard T. is a senior lecturer at the University of Surrey. This is, again, a long name, but it is the Department of Digital Economy, Entrepreneurship, and Innovation, and he is also a member of the digital economy in Europe. Did I get everybody? Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us. So, as I said, the conversation about money is kind of where all roads lead, and what can we learn from other industries? What is the truth about attribution? That's part of why I wanted to play that Squarespace montage. What experiments are out there? What's working? What's actually not working? What do we hope will work in the future? What do listeners think? We have many conversations in the industry that we have representatives from all levels, and very rarely are listeners actually in the room with us to have these conversations. That's an important thing to remember. And as you heard from all of these impressive bios, we have leaders across technology and ethics and revenue, including listener support as well as sponsorship. So I have been thinking a lot about all of these tension points, and I wanted to just start with you, Sarah, and if you could kind of talk about kind of the work of the IAB and why they decided to create the standards, why that was an important milestone.
Sure. So many people in this room were in those early conversations when the IAB had a digital audio group and the podcast members were sort of part of that group. And we realized pretty quickly that we had very different needs from our streaming audio partners in that most of our content was downloaded or progressively downloaded. So we had to figure out how we could all work together to count downloads the same way, just as a first step. NPR played a real important role in that. Our friends at WNYC, some of whom are in the room today, PRX, obviously. We had a group of folks who said, okay, you know, regardless of our individual agendas, we all want to just be able to tell advertisers that when you're buying 100,000 downloads from this group and you're buying 100,000 from this group, you're getting the same amount of stuff for your money. And that was just a crucial first step in gaining the trust of the buying community to be able to know that you know, we were taking ourselves seriously enough to create at least these preliminary standards.
Thank you. And like, let's just spend a minute and talk about listeners. And so as I was mentioning, as part of the membership project, there's an important role for us as a nonprofit organization. We see our revenue as a three-legged stool, and listener support is one of those important legs of the stool. And so, Ariel, could you talk a little bit about what you have seen in the membership models? And you know, as we talked this morning, and this was true for Blake and Manoush's conversation, like what can be scaled and what is really difficult to scale?
Sure. I mean, I think the point that Manoush made about if you're doing a podcast, you need to know the reason you're doing a podcast is something that we say very often to news organizations when they say they're going to launch a membership program. It's very hard to sort of plug and play a membership program because at the heart of a membership program is a social contract between the news organization and its readers, listeners, et cetera. It's what do you give to this organization and what are you getting in return? And that is going to be very different depending on what the organization covers, the geographic context in which they're operating. And so trust is a huge component of that because you're not just creating a product that people are paying to get access to. You're inviting them into a relationship with the organization. One of our grantees, the Daily Maverick, frequently says that with membership, you're monetizing the relationship around the journalism that you're doing rather than the content itself. Mm-hmm. And so that is an incredibly challenging thing to scale. One of the things that we talk to organizations a lot about at MPP is that membership is going to be a pretty small slice of your revenue for probably the first couple years. Most organizations don't see it make up more than 10 to 15% for the first 1 to 3 years before it finally gets there and they can start to run on automation a little bit and understand what messages are going to resonate, who are the different types of people that become members of your organization, that kind of thing. So it's certainly not a scale play, it's an engagement play. And if you're trying to scale membership really rapidly, you can really thin the value of that program relatively quickly. And then you sort of get into a dangerous space where people don't really know what they're a member of anymore.
It's worth noting that some of the most beloved early sort of stars in the podcast land came from membership environments, the public radio, and it's kind of that engagement with the audience is sort of the hallmark of the platform, generally speaking, which is why we care so much about not messing it up. You know? Right.
Well, and I know this to be true, which is that to have a very healthy and vibrant membership program, it takes a lot of infrastructure, sometimes a lot of staff. And so, Marco, you really represent both the technology work of having Overcast, but also, there's a lot of podcasts like yours that have super small teams. If not a very, only a handful. So, what does this mean for you, and how you monetize and the people that you are representing while you sit here today?
I mean, I kind of feel like I'm representing a different world than what most of the people in this room are living and working in. I represent the rest of podcasts, besides the top 1% that most of you are working with or near or on. The reality is the world of podcasts is very, very big. And like, among Overcast listeners, if you look at like, the top podcasts, the ones that have big names that a lot of people would recognize, almost every Overcast listener subscribes to at least one of them, but very few Overcast listeners subscribe only to top-tier shows. The world of podcasts is way bigger than this room and what we care about and the shows that we make or the shows that we've ever even heard of. There are huge segments that most of us don't think about or don't know exist. Like, one of the biggest segments of podcasts is church sermons. No one ever talks about that. No one thinks about it. But there are thousands of churches out there that publish their sermons as podcasts and get millions of downloads for them among all their listeners. That's a thing that isn't part of this world. The world that I'm in is tech podcasts, mostly conversational style, mostly not written or produced by anybody. We make an outline before the show, and we talk like this casually. And that can produce a nice income for a small staff. My show is 3 people and 1 ad salesperson, and all of us do pretty well from it because we keep our costs down. And we have a targeted market that advertisers want. Without DAI, without analytics, without any demographic information, all we tell them is our average download numbers, and we sell it based on that. What I represent is basically the way podcasting has been done for most of the last 15 years and has largely worked great for all of us, including all of you. So where I'm coming from is it's much more, while I'm very liberal politically, I'm very conservative technologically. Where I'm coming from is what we have already, the old RSS ecosystem, is great. It has served us very well all this time, and we're not really hurting for major changes. I think we can achieve 80-90% of what we want with what we already have, and trying to get that last 10% is A, probably impossible, but B, would require changes that could destabilize the entire industry and cause way more problems for all of us.
I think
The
you
only
have a
thing
few
I would say
thoughts
is
on that,
I think
Michelle.
I have a couple. Yeah, and first of all, I'm not with CDT anymore, just greatly adore the organization, but I'm consulting. So what I would say to that is that change is coming, whether you like it or not, unfortunately. I think there is a lot of really positive aspects to the podcast environment, including clunky tech, right? That sort of helped it inure itself from some of the surveillance and tracking that goes on. But venture capital investments are circling, have already come in, and they're going to continue to, which means consolidation, which means less control and ownership over content and distribution. It doesn't necessarily, it's not sort of, I'm not painting a doomsday scenario. I think, advertising is possible. I think your ad fantasy is actually 100% possible. It just creates, you just need more consortiums. You need content creators to use the power, their collective power, and their sort of relationship with their users. I think going forward, especially as cookies go away, that's happening in Google Chrome in the next few years. The cookieless future, to me, spells, content will become even more important, and first-party data will be absolutely crucial. It will be everything. And so to the extent that we see that coming, I think podcasters have the chance to sort of leverage those relationships and protect them. And so, it's not so much change as finding ways to monetize that are ethical and privacy protective and in line with what's coming.
Yeah, Richard, I thought you would add some academic perspective on this.
Yeah, so I'm a bit of an outsider, I guess, and this whole day for me counts as field work. So I'm taking notes. But for me, I think it is important not to be too deterministic if you talk about consolidation in the podcasting space, because it has evolved in this very specific way where you have an open distribution standard, right? And that's very different from all the typical proprietary platforms we know, where they control distribution, right? And typical challenges as a platform owner is you want to connect different sides, right? And solve this sort of chicken and egg problem, right? So in the case of Uber, when Uber started, right, you need riders, but if you don't have riders, right, how do you get drivers and vice versa? So they tried to kickstart things by subsidizing different sides. That whole dynamic is not an issue in podcasting, right? Even originally, the content just emerged organically, basically, right? So you don't have a centralized platform owner. It does mean that there are potential monetization issues, right? That you do have when you have a centralized platform owner like YouTube, right? They basically take care of monetization. So I think that's also where most of the opportunities are in the open ecosystem, is where you get innovation around all these sort of last 10, 20% sorts of challenges, and think about how the open ecosystem can help address some of those concerns that would sort of alleviate the threat, basically, of these more centralized platforms.
Can I ask you a clarifying question? Are you saying that the industry really needs a couple of powerful consolidators in order to propel forward with investments, or are you saying something different?
Well, it doesn't need it necessarily, but I think it is good for the system to have a different type of model, i.e. the more centralized model, as a way for the original RSS-based model to evolve, right? Because I think there have been concerns about how much data do we need, how can we monetize, besides just, talking with Squarespace's ad salesperson, right, who's been responsible for how many % of all ad sales. So I don't think it's healthy for an ecosystem to rely just on one of these couple of players. So I do think it's healthy in some ways. And I think as long as the ecosystem, the open ecosystem, can respond, come up with creative solutions, there's no reason to worry.
I want to kind of pose this back out to you all. So one of the things about the RSS spec is that it underlies all of podcasting from its earliest days, and it also hasn't been improved very much over many years, and so it is an old standard by many internet specs. And so I wanted to just ask, like, how we can protect the open and also evolve the RSS to the new challenges that we face. I don't know, Michelle, you might have a thought about that.
I do. I would say one of the keys, well, look at models that have worked, right? So although this might be being challenged at the moment, but ICANN is a good example. ICANN has managed domains fairly well, and it's even monetized itself through micropayments, et cetera. So it's a pretty good model, though there are rumors that someone's going to buy .org. Hopefully that's not going to happen. That would be catastrophic, I think. But ICANN for identity is one model that I think can help. It's not so much that you're creating a consolidation around content or distribution itself, but around that focus on user identity, around that focus on that relationship, and the relationship between the first party and the person. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and one of the projects that I'm working on is doing something like that.
Yeah, so at its core, we're also talking about, one of the things that many independent podcasters have benefited from is there's very few intermediators and gatekeepers. And so, Marco, this is something you speak about very regularly, and how this has propelled many entrepreneurs. And so, what do you think a responsible gatekeeper could add to the system?
I mean, really, all of us have benefited quite strongly from Apple's presence in the market, because they have been a very responsible gatekeeper, by far the largest presence in podcasting, but also dramatically understaffed and never a priority for the parent company. And they're likely to remain that way. They're staffing up a little bit here and there for like biz dev stuff, but I don't think that's going to be a big change. I think it's going to be a small change. So ultimately, we have gatekeepers. It would be great if we had none, like back in the old blog RSS days, and a lot of us were just using RSS readers, and they would directly access every site and everything, and the directory was just the web. Now we kind of have half that world. We have the direct RSS access in most clients, but the directories are still centralized, and there aren't that many players, or at least not that many with market share. But ultimately, we've benefited from the technological dinosaur of RSS, basically, because what we've shown is that it gives us everything we need to have gotten this far without adding a whole bunch of crap to the standard. We've added almost nothing to it, and because we have this large, mostly asleep dinosaur taking up most of our market share, the chances of getting major technological advances passed and actually implemented by somebody like Apple are pretty low. So we largely are going to just have to work within what we already have. And that's okay, because what we have is great. It's working. It has worked. It is stable. It doesn't lend itself to that much centralization. It doesn't have massive privacy issues besides what a lot of you do with our IP addresses. But besides that, like it's mostly, it's gotten us this far, and it's been really solid, and it has given us what we need. You know, we have to be careful when somebody asks or when somebody poses a problem. They're trying to convince you that you need a solution like what they are offering or wanting to create, and it's easy for us to just accept the premise. Oh yeah, sure, this thing is hard. We need a thing to solve this. But a lot of times, actions speak louder than words, and what we see is that we don't need a thing to solve most of this. Like, we've gotten far just not having a lot of those things, and it's been fine. We can have certain tracking or certain data, or we can just not have it, and advertisers can ask for it, and we can just say, sorry, we can't do that, and some of them won't buy. But obviously, most of them don't care because we sell a lot of ads, and we have a lot of repeat buyers. So they're not stupid. They know what they're getting. We can sell a show targeted solely on audience count and what the show's about, and advertisers, it uses stuff like direct response, and it's not like the most graceful attribution process in the world, but it works. So I just want us all to be careful when we say, like, oh, we need something to move on, or something is inevitable, some kind of advancement is required, when it might not be. And again, like, to get those advancements, A, we might be making a lot of assumptions about adoption that won't hold, but B, they might introduce way greater risks to what we're trying to do here.
I think the current system, yes, if you're talking about not evolving, you're talking about being at the mercy of the direct response advertisers pretty much solely, because brands really need a way to show return on investment, and they're wary of wandering into a space that they can't prove works. And I'm wary of relying completely, don't get me wrong, they're a part of everyone's mix that does any kind of monetization in this room, but that's all. There's a handful of agencies that manage, and I'm talking like 3, that manage all of that business. So when you're talking about putting a whole lot of power in very few hands, that's a thing if you don't evolve or if you rely entirely on direct response advertising. Also, I talk to creators every day, and many of them have shows that for whatever reason, the nature of the content is not conducive to direct response performance. And so, do they not deserve to live another day? Because they need revenue to survive as well. So when you diversify the advertising pool, you enable more kinds of content to occur, and that diversifies the content pool, which brings more people into the space. And so the evolution doesn't necessarily have to be driven by the undying need to scale at all costs. It could actually be good for the population,
I'm curious if anyone has some examples about hybrids, like where you have, and Richard, you sent a little bit ago, you mentioned YouTube, but YouTube is the second largest search engine in the world, owned by the first. So that's not very open. So if you could help us understand a little bit about what are the other things we can draw upon.
Yeah, I mean, I was just you were talking about creators earlier and sort of barriers to entry. I do think, even though I largely agree with Marco that the current system is really quite nice, and it would be good to have at least some of this existing also in 10 years from now. But taking the other side of the argument, I think for these more centralized platforms, one of the benefits they potentially introduce is that they do lower barriers to entry, right? Because at the moment, it is still quite difficult, not if you're a technical person, but if you're a regular person, to actually create a podcast, right? And work around the whole infrastructure. So those are some of the benefits that I think centralized players have. And then I think it's, again, up to the sort of open podcasting community to come up with ways to lower those barriers to entry.
Yeah, and so that we can have many new voices, many new shows that do not exist today. That would be a healthy kind of growth pattern.
I was going to say, I think so I mentioned earlier the project that I'm working on, and I think it poses a good model for the podcasting space. So it's with the Local Media Consortium, which is a group of local news organizations and media organizations across the US. And so what they saw about 2 years ago or so was, what we've all seen, which is local news just nosedive. And so to help their members get benefits and to try to help them grow, they started doing partnerships with Google and Facebook and other things, and they negotiate rates with them. But it was sort of more apparent to them even then that what they were handing over to Google and Facebook was the user identities, right? That's the key to their success. Yeah, I'm sure you all see Google, Facebook Connect and logins, right? And it's even more and more, you might have noticed lately. So that is because that first-party data is the most valuable. So they have a bunch of stuff on us, but once they can connect who we are, it becomes exponentially valuable. So, so what I'm doing with LMC is creating so they have the consortium of content creators already. And the idea is to build a privacy policy that's unified across the consortium, that is compliant with CCPA and GDPR, the privacy laws that are coming, which for me wasn't super hard to make because it's sort of just defaulting to the highest possible privacy, so it's sort of fun. Everybody looked at me like I had 15 heads, but it was, trying to look at it from a user perspective. What do I really not? I don't want anything really, right, to happen by default. And then I'll let you know when I'm cool with other stuff. So building that, creating a set of governance rules that would sort of govern all the actors in this ecosystem. And so the idea is to have a single sign-on, which is this Facebook Connect idea. It's a federated authentication. So you as a user can come to the San Jose Mercury News and log in, and you're authenticated by, this is crucial, a third-party nonprofit. So the governing body is not a hedge fund, is not a billionaire or a Google. It's a third-party nonprofit that sets the rules and audits the rules. So again, sort of that's why I think of ICANN. It's a similar model. And you can build a system that has a user data exchange. And again, this technology exists. This is your ad fantasy, Manoush. This is, it just hasn't really been deployed in this way. In Europe, it has a sort of, but so the idea is that you can set your privacy preferences in this ecosystem. You can access all of the content across the consortium, which many people actually really like from some of the testing we've done because their kid goes to college in Fresno, but they live in New York, or there's all kinds of ways in which they want to keep tabs on their hometown local news, et cetera. So they can access that content and set their privacy preferences. It's persistent. Their relationship is still first with their publisher, but they can be advertised to, but advertisers can't take any data back. And so interestingly, a lot of brands are, they're looking for this brand safe environment. Right now it's the Wild West, it's mostly bots that are trained to click and go. And so, IAB and advertisers are just enraged at the amount of fraud that is happening on the one hand. On the other hand, everybody's making money, so there's sort of a tension there. But the user data
display, I would point out.
And display, yeah. So the user data exchange allows for that advertising, and it gives the brands a lot of incentive because they know it's a high quality pool of data of users. So this is I think a model that can work for podcasting, although it would be different. But what you're really doing with this third party nonprofit is taking away some of that sort of tension between you're building value in a consortium that all of a sudden somebody buys, right, and starts to make rules for. This is saying we're setting standards, and of course that includes open source and all of the values that exist in the podcasting world today. And these are standards that can be enforced across the ecosystem. So you're not allowed to be in there if you're an advertiser that is going to try to take it away. And the nice thing about that too is you can still work with the Google and Facebooks of the world, but the publishers own that connection with you. And so you can have them distribute things for you, but you're not giving that up, and therefore you're not giving up the value of your content that you created and incentivizing high quality content instead of the clickbait that is currently incentivized by bots and sort of the bottom feeders. So that I think is, this kind of system could also enable like a sovereign wallet kind of system for micropayments, whether to the user or back. So there's lots of flexibility, and again, this tech exists. It's the publishers saying, okay, we will give up this the system that we have allowed to sort of erode our content and go towards this new system. And that's what LMC is trying to move its members to do. But it's a slow process, and we're prototyping the SSO this month. But I think it's a model worth looking at.
That's very helpful. And this relationship with first-party data and the relationship with the listeners is something that you study every day at the membership puzzle. And kind of what is it that you are hopeful about, and what is it that you worry about as you kind of think about what comes next?
What Michelle just sort of sketched out is a really exciting thing for publishers. And the thing I was thinking about as she explained it is, so MPP, we started from the perspective of what motivates people to become members of news organizations. And we've always studied this from the perspective of the audience members, not what the news organizations need, but what audience members expect of their news organizations, what will drive them to support them. And we are news organizations doing so much behind the scenes to address so many of these problems, and we do a really poor job of explaining what we're doing. At MPP, so much of our work has ended up being about helping organizations explain how they work, explain their finances, break down when they launch something like this, how can you explain this to the average person? Privacy is a really scary topic for the vast majority of people that engage with news organizations or engage with the internet. They have no idea what's being tracked on them. They have no idea how it's being used. They don't even understand the terminology. And so one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about at MPP vis-a-vis privacy is it's just as much about being intentional about what data you collect, but then also explaining what data you're collecting. And if you're very clear and transparent about that, you actually start to get a little bit more space from your readers to start tracking certain things about them. These are the reasons we have a newsletter, and here's what we have turned on in MailChimp, and this is how we use it. And it plays into that trust at MPP. Like, to launch a membership program, you need to have the trust of your readers in order to ask them to financially support your work. So how do we explain that? One of our grantees, the Daily Maverick in South Africa, in their About Us page, they also have an entire glossary of privacy terms. What are cookies? What is third-party tracking? All these things that, unless you work in this space, make no sense to you. And I really love this because it's just a very reassuring thing to do. They break these terms down into basic language, and then they explain what they are. And some of these are not even things that they track about their users. But in order to reassure users they don't track it, they're making sure that users understand that terminology in the first place. And so we're working with organizations that are very small. We focus on sort of the digital membership space. And those are tiny organizations that aren't tracking all these things, but they also need to explain what these things are and the fact that they're not tracking them, not just correct course if they're doing something wrong.
Yeah, that education is so important. And even probably within the last 5 years, sales people were explaining what a podcast is to agencies. And so, like, we're talking about a very truncated amount of time. Sarah, I was wondering, like, one of the things that I think is kind of hangs over worry in the worry category, which is, will advertisers vacate the space if there isn't a ton of data and intrusive data? And so in the early days when we had the direct response ad companies, I've heard you say this before, they're kind of like the canary in the coal mine. If you can make it work for DR, you can kind of make it work for anything. But as more brands come in, and there's this promise of what everybody's talking about, which is trust and engagement, and in many ways, a donation is a great indicator of commitment to a show. It's a kind of a bellwether. But what is it that is where's the spook factor of from the ad agency side?
So their spook factor is having it be harder or different from all of the other things that they buy and work with, right? So right now we're in this middle ground where we've evolved from just vanity URLs and promo codes, and we're able to connect the dots between an IP address and a pixel from a person that requests an ad file from the server to an activity online. So you can kind of prove that, yeah, the person that heard the Squarespace ad actually signed up for a membership. That all of a sudden changed, to be able to show that in a measurable way and not just a directional way, made a lot more brands sort of turn their head and look at it. Because if you can connect the dots, then you're laying down the train tracks to a destination, which is integration with their other investments of data. So now we're in a world where brands want to know a couple of things. It depends on their KPIs or key performance indicators for a campaign, but if they can find out, did running this campaign or investing in this collection of shows change the way someone feels about my brand, they're going to do a different kind of study. That's a brand lift study. So that's measuring how a group felt before and after they were exposed to that message in that context. They've been doing this for a while. It's a little problematic in that sometimes the panel that's being exposed to the message isn't the same panel that's actually listening to the show. It's just podcast listeners, but that's evolving as well. There are vendors that are really digging into that and trying to figure out, you know, are people behaving differently because they were exposed to this ad? I think the next 12 steps ahead is really ad agencies, particularly the big holding companies, have invested millions in collecting an audience in their environment. And they have this collection that they want to inject into some system that can then be pushed into podcasting so they can find those same people that they know everything about in all these other places and verify that those are the same people that they know about so that their message will have more impact if they reach them here too. So it's really about, there's a need on the agency side to find out if we're moving in a direction that will allow them to get more value from the data they already have.
Right, because as they're thinking about their buying, they're thinking about it in terms of an ecosystem of all kinds of places that they want to be, and they're going to look for, if the standards are super varying across all, it kind of makes them stumble, it creates an education issue.
Exactly, and so we're at a moment in time, and again, my description of this is not an endorsement of it, nor is it a rejection of it, it's just a description. And so we're at a moment in time, particularly because of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where steps have been taken in the rest of digital media to put the brakes on, put a red flag up to make sure that we're aware of what's going on. Podcasting, we don't have to be pulled back from anywhere. We haven't gone there yet, right? So if we move forward with an informed point of view, and perhaps with some of these models that you're talking about, which sound amazing, by the way, and Kerri, I hope you launch that nonprofit organization. But we have the opportunity to do it right. And I feel, just because I'm such a fangirl of the medium, if any platform were going to do it right, it would be this one, just because of how it evolved and that relationship that we do have with our audiences and how that's been, like I said, the hallmark of this medium all along.
I want to ask, so Richard, as you think about your academic position, you look at other digital platforms, what are the key, and as you said earlier, you're a real champion of more innovation and more experiments to, I think you said, let's not be too fatalistic too early in terms of the fork in the road that we find ourselves. And what are the things that you have seen that are cautionary tales for us to, when we talk about what we want to avoid, we all have an anecdotal version of that is meaningful, but if you can give us the academic version of kind of what is the most important thing to avoid as it has been in other platforms.
Yeah, and I can talk about cautionary tales, but I do also want to end on a sort of an optimistic note. But the first example that comes to mind is this sort of enthusiasm that was there around RSS in terms of blogging, right? And how that whole Web 2.0 would kind of democratize text, and then Facebook came along and did the opposite, basically, right? And that happened very quickly. But I do think, like, when I hear about LMC and those sorts of initiatives, the good thing about podcasting right now, at least the sort of open system, is in a position of strength. So unlike local news, it's not being done out of desperation, right? But rather out of sort of opportunities that are out there right now. And then the final thing, in terms of sort of patterns about how ecosystems evolve, what we do know about proprietary systems and how decentralized alternatives compete with those, that is actually very difficult. Once you have a proprietary system, the decentralized alternative, it's almost impossible to dethrone the proprietary system, right? So that doesn't follow necessarily that once you have an open ecosystem, that it also is much more difficult for the proprietary system to overtake it. But it does show that these systems are inert and are hard to change. So it will be really quite difficult, I think, to change podcasting in this really dramatic way where suddenly you have a YouTube of podcasting and that's the only choice. So I don't think that's very likely to happen. There could be all sorts of hybrid forms of coexistence between an open and closed form, and then it's just a matter of how small or how big does the open ecosystem remain.
Yeah, and where the where money pools and where gravity pulls us. I don't have a clock up here, so I just know time. Great. And so one of the things that some of the facts about the podcast industry is there are about 850,000, which most people in this room know, and the advertising dollars are predicted to hit about $1 billion by 2021, if not a little bit sooner. And so that's why these conversations are really critical in terms of what are things that we are worried about, but also the hope. And I'm so thrilled that the panel is so optimistic about what you see moving forward, because that's actually what we need. That's what we move forward with. And so as we think about the next steps, if you could kind of take out a crystal ball and just say a few words. We'll just kind of do run down the panel here, because somebody might say something that will lead to just a final question. But talk about what really gives you hope and gives you the best optimism for what could come next. If you were queen for the day, Sarah Van Mosel.
I mean, the thing is, every month that goes by, amazing new shows come into the world, and I think that the ecosystem that we've created, as flawed as it is, allows that to happen. And when new shows launch of a certain flavor that bring in new people to the space that were never in the space before, that makes me happy. So I would like this existing flawed system to go on just a little bit longer until we get to the point where we can launch the kinds of shows that are bringing in 50% of the population, 80% of the population. Then all of a sudden, we've got some leverage there where we can dictate to the advertising community how it's going to go as a group. Like, I'm extremely optimistic about this idea of a nonprofit third-party verifying identity so that we can do all the cool reindeer games that we want to do, but do it in a way that's safe, right? And I think that that's something that I would love to commit to participating in, personally.
Richard?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's mostly about incentives. So as long as the incentives are there for these different stakeholders to pretty much stay with the existing system, I think that's reason for optimism. So I think then it's up to the community to also think sort of more self-consciously about these sorts of events and kind of self-present podcasting as this open ecosystem against these sort of techlash that's happening against centralized platforms.
Mm-hmm. So I'm sort of an eternal optimist, which is weird when you are a privacy advocate in DC, but I am somehow. I think, two things. One is when Cambridge Analytica happened, I felt, there was a shift in the ground, and it was partly because, in my opinion, people understood the connection between privacy and democracy. Mm-hmm. It was much more clear than ever before. And so, to me, using privacy as the innovation is exactly what we did when the web was starting, and it's exactly what we should do now. And then using the idea that democratic values should underpin these ecosystems really excites me.
And the trust.
The reason I'm here, right? The reason I jumped at the chance to work with ITEGA and LMC. So I feel that when content creators take back their power, I guess is the best way to put it, and sort of see the value of doing these collective actions. I think there's a great deal of optimism that I feel about that, and also that privacy, like I said, it can be the innovation, but it's also the underpinning value for democracies. You know, they don't really function without it, and neither do good content consortiums. So.
I mean, I could talk about a lot of different things, but I'll try to keep it focused. What gives me hope for this medium is that everything we're saying is a want, not a need. Everything that we're saying is like, well, you know, it'd be nice, you know, and, you know, advertisers like, yeah, it'd be nice. Everything advertisers say is a want, not a need. The reality is advertisers go where the people are, and that's their only need. And if the reason why they're coming to podcasts after years of not knowing they existed is because there's a lot of people here. And the reality is we have one of the best forms of advertising that works in the entire world, if not the best. We have incredible CPMs compared to any other media type. We have incredible listener engagement. We haven't had to stoop to running crappy ads and bargain basement, like, you know, terrible sounding stuff or scammy, like low rank kind of stuff. We've had really good ads and really good monetization in ways that our listeners aren't constantly being sold out to deliver it to them. Their privacy is largely being respected most of the time. And when it isn't, they email me, please stop all the DAI stuff. But anyway, what we have is already really strong. Like Richard said, like, we're coming from a place of strength here. We are incredibly strong. We have good economics. We have good content. We have good listeners. The ads are, you know, as I said, very high CPM, very, you know, high quality. Let's not wreck it. I don't know anybody who's a big video producer who likes YouTube very much. I don't know anybody who's a big text producer who likes Google and Facebook very much. Let's not create one of those in our industry. And I think if we do our jobs right, and if we preserve and strengthen what we already have, I think we can get there. Mm-hmm. Finally, I would urge you to, use the capabilities we already have. There's a lot of capabilities out there that RSS feeds and existing podcast players have that most of you aren't using. I don't see a lot of good show notes out there. I don't see a lot of websites that actually have permalinks for each episode that I can use to share. DAI breaks timestamp sharing, so if somebody shares a timestamp to something that, you know, they listen to, they want someone else to hear it, and your DAI introduces different length ads for that episode, it's going to jump to a different time in that episode, and so they're not going to hear the right thing. So if you're going to use DAI, fix the time at least. So there's so much we can do. Chapter markers. How many of you have used a chapter marker in this decade? Right? Did you know that chapter markers are supported by, like, at least, I think, 80% of the podcast player market, including things like showing specific images and clickable URLs in certain time ranges? That's what so many people want and try to make new standards for. We already have one that can do that. It's supported by almost every player. Use what we have. And then if you want to build on top of that, build that a layer above it. Build that on the web layer. Have people go to your website. You can click on it right in the player if you've done your job right with the show notes and everything. Go to your website, and that's where you can have things like membership programs and mailing lists and all sorts of other stuff. Use the web and use what we have before we try to develop new things that, again, could destabilize this or create a YouTube or create a Facebook or a Google. So anyway, I think we're doing great, and I think any effort to destabilize us probably isn't going to work. We've seen hundreds of millions of dollars of VC money burn up in flames trying to destroy what we have, and we're going to keep doing that.
All right, you heard it here, optimism from Marco. Ariel.
This world where Marco works sounds really nice. I wish I worked there. I come from a digital media background where we wrecked so many things, and we're in the process of trying to rebuild those relationships and re-earn that trust. And we're operating from a place of immense need, and really starting from scratch with so many of our users, whether we're an older organization trying to restore trust that we broke, or we're a new organization trying to convince people that we are going to do things differently. But there are two things that I'm watching really closely and that make me really hopeful for where the membership space is going. First off, we've talked about the markup multiple times today, and they launched with a pledge to collect as little personal data as possible on their users. And all of us in the audience development space, I think, especially in the digital space, are looking at that quite closely and really eager to hear how that goes. They've created a formidable challenge for their marketing strategy, their growth strategy, by not collecting that information, but they also have a team of really smart people And I think it will be really exciting to see where they go and how they plan alternative strategies, not having the kind of information that so many digital operations are operating with. The other thing that I'm really excited about is the sort of rapid adoption of human-centered design and other types of qualitative audience research by digital organizations. More and more organizations are going for engagement over scale, and so their numbers aren't super impressive to advertisers, particularly in the local news space. But when they can talk about how well they know their readers, the relationships that those readers have, that becomes a really compelling strategy, especially when you're talking to like local civic institutions or local small businesses or things like that. I come from a local media background, and my previous company, The Nootropic, launched with 6 months of human-centered design research into the information needs and habits of Miami residents. And that became really powerful information to walk into meetings with local advertisers and things like that. And we could say, these are the types of people who read our newsletter. This is how they spend their Saturday nights. This is how they commute to work. These are the other organizations that they're a part of. And that information is far more powerful than the information that we get from tracking people. And there's been a lot of progress. And I think it's actually Local Media Consortium that has the big branded content project. There are all these other sort of revenue models that are emerging that work off of the qualitative information that we know off of our audience members. And there's been so much progress in understanding how to talk to advertisers about that. When the Nootropic started doing this in 2015, every single meeting was an education exercise.
Yeah.
We had to explain why people should care about engagement over scale. So many advertisers now understand that, and so we're operating from a place where now we can just make the case for our organization, not have to explain why you should care about engagement in the first place.
Well, and this is our experience too, it's been echoed here, that there are shows without a big audience that are super successful. They have deep engagement. So I just want to pull on a couple of things here. One is I just want to restate, because it's so important and it's so overlooked, like the metadata and the opportunity that we have is like very often overlooked by many people who make shows. They just don't use the show notes properly, and we see it all the time. And so here for metadata. I posed the question this morning in my opening remarks, is the disaggregated nature of podcasting a strength or a weakness? And I think what you're hearing, like overwhelmingly, is that it's actually a strength, and it can help it grow and keep the openness of it intact, and it is a strength of negotiation and power if we kind of take the leadership mantle. Closed systems can often inhibit excellence by their very nature. And so, that's kind of another thing that you've heard repeated here. And a couple of other threads that, look for hybrid models, contextualized and topically based ads, neutrality, education. And, this is kind of underlying everything that's been said today, is that in the way that podcasting has grown up, every show that has been successful has done so with the currency of trust. And that is not to be traded lightly or easily. And it is a superpower in many ways. And it is the thing that we need to hold on to for the future. So I hope that you will be staying with us. These are some really amazing and thoughtful, brilliant people, and I hope that you mingle with them throughout the day. Thank you all for your time.